The Mesha Stela is a basalt monument that was discovered in 1868, and it tells the story. It's one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time, in my estimation, because in many ways it confirms a biblical story.
1208 BC. A limestone slab is carved under Pharaoh Merneptah in ancient Egypt. It lists military victories with administrative precision. Cities defeated, regions subdued. Then one line breaks the pattern. A people is named. Not a city, not a territory, a people, Israel. The name appears before monarchy existed, before temples were centralized, before structures that define nations were in place. Yet, Egyptian scribes, working for a pagan ruler with no interest in validating any covenant, recorded the name anyway. They classified it precisely, used the determinative marker reserved for people groups, not kingdoms. The stone was not seeking to prove anything. It was documenting what was encountered, but timing has its own order, and this inscription now sits in tension with narratives constructed 1,300 years later that claim Israel was never a distinct people in that land during that period. The artifact itself is direct in function. The Merneptah Stele, a black granite monument standing over 7 feet tall, discovered in 1896 by Flinders Petrie at Thebes in Upper Egypt. It is not a theological text, not a story, not a reflection on meaning. It is an administrative record commissioned to document the outcomes of military campaigns during the 5th year of Pharaoh Merneptah's reign. Merneptah was the successor of Ramesses II. He ruled during Egypt's 19th dynasty at the end of the Late Bronze Age. His campaigns extended across 2 regions. One section addresses Libya, another turns toward Canaan, the land corridor connecting Africa and Asia that Egypt sought to control for strategic and economic reasons. Egyptian victory inscriptions followed strict conventions. They were formulaic. They listed defeated enemies by name. They used specific grammatical markers to classify what was being named. Cities were marked with determinatives indicating fortified places. Lands carried different signs denoting territories. People groups were marked with a third type of symbol. The system was not decorative. It conveyed administrative categories. The scribes were trained. The classifications were consistent. Within the Canaan section, the stele names several entities: Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, cities. Then the pattern shifts. Israel is wasted, his seed is not. The line is brief. The tone is final. But the grammatical marker used for Israel is distinct. It identifies a people, not a city-state, not a kingdom, not a bounded territory, a group defined by identity rather than political infrastructure. This is not an interpretation. It is observable in the hieroglyphs themselves. Egyptian scribes understood what they were documenting. A distinct people present in the land without the centralized structures Egypt associated with established power. This single line is the earliest known extra-biblical reference to Israel in recorded history. It predates the formation of the Israelite monarchy. It predates the construction of Solomon's temple. It predates every religious text produced after the biblical canon. And it predates Islam by over 1,800 years. The stone was carved by a polytheistic empire with no theological stake in Israel's existence. The name appears because it had to, because it was encountered, because Egyptian administration required accurate record-keeping to track subjugated populations and ensure future compliance. The timing of this reference is critical. 1208 BC places the inscription at the end of the Late Bronze Age. According to biblical chronology, this period corresponds to the era of the Judges, after the Exodus from Egypt, after the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, before the establishment of the centralized monarchy under Saul and David. The Book of Judges describes exactly this condition: a confederation of tribes organized by kinship and covenant rather than political bureaucracy. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Judges chapter 21, verse 25. The verse is not poetic. It is observational. It describes a structural reality, the same structural reality that the Egyptian scribe recorded from the outside. Scripture places Israel in the land during this transitional period. You went over the Jordan and came to Jericho. Joshua chapter 24, verse 11. The text does not describe a kingdom. It describes movement and presence. Entry before establishment. Identity before institution. The Merneptah stele aligns with that sequence without referencing Scripture. It documents the same stage from an external vantage point. Egypt encountered a people in Canaan, not a state, not a dynasty, a people. The classification matches what the biblical text presents internally during the same period. This creates a problem for later narratives that claim Israel did not exist as a distinct people in that land until much later. The Quran, compiled in the 7th century AD, over 1800 years after the Merneptah stele was carved, contains references to the children of Israel. But Islamic tradition generally frames Israelite identity in ways that disconnect it from continuous land-based presence during the biblical period. Some interpretations within Islamic scholarship have suggested that the modern Jewish claim to the land lacks a historical foundation, or that the identity of ancient Israel was fundamentally different from later Jewish communities. The stele disrupts this framing. It is a fixed point, unchangeable, documented by a source with no incentive to validate biblical claims. Egypt was not preserving the Israelite heritage. Egypt was recording resistance encountered during a military campaign. The name appears because the people existed. The classification is precise because Egyptian administration required precision. The stone cannot be revised. It cannot be reinterpreted to fit later theological systems. It stands outside those systems entirely. A pagan empire recorded what it found. That record remains. If you're following this evidence and want to see where it leads, subscribe now, because the next section connects this inscription to the pattern Scripture establishes about identity and recognition. The broader archaeological context supports this alignment. Across the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, evidence of Israelite presence in the Central Hill Country of Canaan increases. Settlement patterns shift. Material culture shows distinctions from the surrounding Canaanite populations. Pig bones, common in Philistine and Canaanite sites, are absent from highland settlements identified with early Israel. Dietary practices aligned with later biblical law appear in the archaeological record before centralized religious institutions existed to enforce them. This suggests that identity markers were already operative at the group level during the pre-monarchic period. The Merneptah stele does not exist in isolation. It fits within a larger pattern of external powers documenting Israel unintentionally while pursuing their own objectives. Centuries later, Assyrian records mention the northern kingdom of Israel. The Moabite stone references conflicts with Israel. Babylonian chronicles document the destruction of Jerusalem. Persian decrees acknowledge the return of exiles. Each of these records was produced by foreign powers for their own administrative or propagandistic purposes. Yet each preserves evidence of Israelite presence, continuity, and identity across centuries. The pattern is consistent. Israel is recorded by others, not through self-promotion, but through encounter and conflict. This external documentation carries unique weight. It cannot be dismissed as internal bias or religious myth-making. These were hostile or indifferent sources with no reason to fabricate Israelite identity. They recorded what they had to account for: resistance, tribute, rebellion, defeat. The administrative reality required accurate names and classifications. The Merneptah stele is the earliest known instance of this pattern. Egypt names Israel because Egypt encountered Israel. The record survives because stone endures beyond the empire that carved it. The biblical prophetic framework operates on a longer timeline than human kingdoms. Scripture consistently presents identity as preceding political form. Before Israel had kings, before borders were formalized, before institutions were centralized, the covenant established identity. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Exodus chapter 6, verse 7. The verse establishes a relationship before structure. Identity is relational and covenantal, not political. The Merneptah Stele documents the outcome of that earlier establishment. A people exists in the land. Recognition follows identity. The stone does not create meaning. It confirms the sequence. This distinction matters because modern disputes over historical presence often conflate identity with statehood. The absence of centralized monarchy or monumental architecture is sometimes used to argue that Israel did not exist as a distinct entity during the Late Bronze Age. But that argument imposes later categories onto an earlier period. The Merneptah Stele shows that Egypt itself did not require those categories to recognize Israel. The scribes identified a people. That classification was sufficient. It was accurate, and it was preserved. The Stele also reveals how external empires functioned as unintentional witnesses to the biblical sequence. Egypt did not set out to validate Scripture. Egypt set out to assert dominance. Yet in doing so, Egyptian records intersected with the timeline Scripture presents. This happens repeatedly. Empires pursue power. In documenting their pursuits, they preserve fragments of a larger story they do not comprehend. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1. The verse speaks of sovereignty operating through human action without human awareness. What makes the Merneptah Stele particularly significant in the present moment is not discovery. The stone has been known for over a century. What has shifted is the context in which it is read. Disputes over Israelite identity, historical presence, and covenantal continuity have intensified. Archaeological evidence is frequently reinterpreted to serve competing narratives. In this environment, fixed records gain clarity. The Stele does not adjust to modern pressure. It does not soften language. It does not accommodate later theological systems. It remains exactly what it was. A record carved in stone by a pagan empire that documented what it encountered. This stability is rare. Most historical evidence requires interpretation. Context must be reconstructed. Motivations must be inferred. But the Merneptah Stele is explicit. The hieroglyphs are clear. The grammatical markers are standard. The classification is unambiguous. Israel is named as a people in Canaan around 1208 BC. That fact does not depend on belief. It depends on literacy. Anyone who can read Egyptian hieroglyphs can verify the claim. The stone speaks for itself. The convergence of this evidence with current discourse is notable. Questions about who has a historical claim to the land, about whether Jewish identity is continuous with ancient Israel, and about whether biblical accounts reflect real events, all of these debates return to the question of presence. Was Israel there? When? In what form? The Merneptah Stele answers those questions from outside the debate. Yes. Late Bronze Age. As a recognized person, the answer is carved in stone. Literally, Islamic tradition generally accepts that the children of Israel existed in antiquity. The Quran refers to Moses, to Pharaoh, to the Exodus, and to entry into the land. But the framing often disconnects ancient Israelites from modern Jewish identity or questions the continuity of their presence in the land. Some Islamic interpretations suggest that later Jewish communities represent a break from the original children of Israel, or that claims to the land based on ancient history are invalidated by subsequent events, including exile and dispersion. The Merneptah Stele complicates this narrative. It places Israel in the land during the biblical period as a distinct, recognized people. It does so using Egyptian administrative language that had no theological agenda. The stone does not care about later disputes. It documents a moment. That moment aligns with biblical chronology. It precedes Islamic revelation by 18 centuries. It cannot be reinterpreted without ignoring the artifact itself. The hieroglyphs do not change. The determinatives do not adjust. The record is fixed. This does not prove every detail of the biblical narrative. Archaeology cannot validate faith, but it does establish parameters. It narrows what can be responsibly claimed about the past. It shows that dismissing Israelite presence in Canaan during the Late Bronze Age requires ignoring external, non-biblical evidence produced by a hostile empire. That is not a sustainable position for any system claiming historical seriousness. The stele also demonstrates a recurring biblical principle. Truth is often preserved through opponents. Balaam was hired to curse Israel, but ended up blessing them. Pharaoh's own records document the people he sought to control. Nebuchadnezzar's chronicles preserve the fall of Jerusalem. Roman records mention Christ and early Christians. The pattern is consistent. God uses the testimony of adversaries to establish facts that outlast empires. Surely the wrath of man shall praise you. Psalm 76, verse 10. The line is paradoxical but observable. Human opposition becomes the vehicle for preservation. The timing of the stele's renewed relevance is also significant. For decades, it was cited in footnotes and moved past. Now it is central to debates over identity and continuity. This shift did not happen because the stone changed. It happened because the questions being asked changed. As narratives multiply and disputes intensify, stable reference points become critical. The Merneptah stele offers exactly that. It is immovable. It predates the disputes. It answers questions that were not yet being asked when it was carved. This convergence suggests that clarity often precedes transition. Before major shifts, foundations are revisited, records resurface, fixed points are re-examined. Scripture describes this pattern. I will remember my covenant. Leviticus chapter 26, verse 42. The statement does not introduce something new. It brings forward what was already established. The stele functions similarly. It does not announce, it reminds. What is at stake is not just academic. The question of whether Israel existed as a distinct people in the land during the biblical period has implications for theology, for politics, for identity. The Merneptah stele does not resolve every dimension of that question, but it does establish one fact beyond reasonable dispute. 1208 BC. Canaan, a people called Israel, recognized by Egypt, documented in stone. The fact stands. The implications extend. Conclusion. The Merneptah stele does not argue. It records. A pharaoh commissioned a monument to assert dominance over enemies. In doing so, he fixed a name in stone that would outlast his dynasty, his empire, and every system built after him. The intent was political. The outcome was preservational. Israel appears not through self-promotion but through encounter. Egypt documented what it found. That documentation endures. Scripture operates on a longer horizon. It establishes identity before recognition. The Lord knows those who are His. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19. The verse assumes continuity that does not depend on external validation. Yet, external validation arrives anyway, not to prove faith, but to limit speculation. The stele does not make Israel real. It makes denial of Israel's historical presence untenable. In an age of competing narratives, ancient evidence carries unique authority. It cannot be edited. It cannot be adjusted to fit later needs. It stands outside the systems that now contest its meaning. The Merneptah stele is one such piece of evidence, carved by a pagan empire, preserved through millennia, resurfacing at a moment when foundational questions are being reopened. The stone does not force conclusions. It sets boundaries. It shows what must be accounted for. A people existed, a name was known, a presence was recognized. These facts remain fixed while interpretations shift around them. The stele offers no commentary. It simply holds position. And in holding position, it becomes a reference point that clarifies what can and cannot be responsibly claimed about the past. Something continues across time. Many engage the surface. Few return to foundations. The Merneptah stele remains where it has always been, not arguing, not persuading, simply standing, a witness carved in stone by those who did not intend to witness. A record preserved by empires that did not know what they were preserving, a name that endures because it was already established before the stone was ever carved.